Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Sylvia Ann Hewlett, economist, consultant, entrepreneur, author of many terrific books, most recently, or soon to come out, I should say, Executive Presence 2.0, Leadership in an Age of Inclusion. Sylvia, it's so good to see you.
It's fabulous to get together again, Diane. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, we spoke in 2014 when you came out with the first Executive Presence book. So I'm really curious what prompted you to write a second one.
It had some real triggers. In 2021, I was invited to Iceland and then to Jordan, to the Dead Sea, to talk to women's conferences about executive presence. Obviously, I'm deeply into the importance of gender smarts at the top of the house. I've written a lot about it. And what I felt increasingly in those months was that it was still very useful. This was a book, that's translated into 7 languages. It is a bit of a classic these days. But a couple of things have happened. First off, the pandemic. We all need to learn to lead virtually. And that is a whole separate thing. But even more important, I think that the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, but also, LGBTQ rights have changed the leadership equation. Because if we are to efficiently and effectively, use the top talent in the world, you have to be able to seamlessly cross divides of demographics, whether it's ethnicity, gender, or sexual preference, or geography. One thing that really surprised me in Reykjavik and in Amman was that some of the things on the minds of those amazing leaders in those 2 very, very different countries were stubborn in the sense that they have been around for a while.
Such as what?
The inequality in the work of care. And in the Arab world, elder care is very much a live issue on the shoulders of 40-something-year-old women leaders, because there's an expectation that you don't delegate this, that looking after your mother-in-law, right, can't be solved by putting this person in assisted living. And in a sense, there was more daughterly guilt than maternal guilt in Amman. Whereas, in Reykjavik, it was a very different picture. But very self-conscious about how that was still lowering their ability to forge through to leadership, that they were stuck in the marzipan layer, that rich but sticky level below the top. And they also felt that they didn't have the tools to have strong enough voices around decision-making tables, and they were looking to me to some extent to produce a more refined set of tactics and techniques in this more complicated world we're in.
Let's remind people, Sylvia, as to how you define executive presence.
Executive presence, both 10 years ago and today, is this dynamic mix of gravitas, communication, and appearance. How you behave, how you speak, how you look. Now, gravitas is the elephant in the room. It's 2/3 of the equation. And back in 2012, which is when I collected my last data, I really unpacked what the heck was gravitas. And there were 6 things that rose to the top in terms of what leaders and companies were looking for. And I used exactly the same questionnaire questions, in 2022 and early 2023. And what I have, right now is this 10-year timeline in terms of what has stayed the same and what has changed.
And those 6 categories that you have, can we just remind people what the 6 factors are in gravitas?
First off, top of the list, confidence. The ability to project grace under fire, because confidence is particularly important in troubled times. Number 2, decisiveness. Number 3, and this is a new one in 2022, inclusivity. the ability to convey the fact that you value difference and
Mm-hmm.
the value add that other identities bring to the table. Number 4, vision. Obviously, a path forward that is inspiring. Number 5 is respect for others. And again, that's new on the list. And finally, integrity.
One of the things that's interesting about executive presence and how we think about it today is I often think about the fact that we recognize excellence in a form that reminds us of ourselves. And, you know, when you think about inclusivity, there are so many different voices, different styles coming to the table. Have you had any pushback on that at all, Sylvia, in terms of broadening the definition of what executive presence needs to look like today?
I produce quite a lot of evidence in terms of what it looks like on the ground.
Yeah.
And what I found is that I did 73 interviews this last year with senior executives in gaming and fintech, as well as finance and tech itself, right? So I tried to dig into exemplars. You know, what did this look like on the ground? And I'll tell you, one reason that is seen as a kind of poster person in terms of exemplar of modern leadership is that, first off, she had extraordinary, not just competence and grace under fire and grit and determination to go on that 7-year journey, you know, to transform IBM, which employed 250,000 people.
Ginny Rometty, yeah.
Yeah, totally. You know, an amazingly confident, determined leader with a great vision. She took it upon herself to create P-Tech, which was a program for high school graduates to give them the possibility of training and a job in STEM professions. And that was her form of inclusion. And it was quite brilliant because it meant that IBM never had the labor shortages other tech firms had during that period. And it has also created one of the lowest attrition rates in terms of turnover in the engineering pipeline at IBM. And she uses this as an example of how valuable, you know, imaginative inclusion can be. So what I got a lot of people to talk about is why it was valuable, this, you know, inclusive thing. And, you know, Albert Buller at Pfizer has also done this, you know, global access program, which was added enormously to Pfizer's bottom line recently and reached over $1 billion. Well, it's headed up by an amazing Chinese woman who grew up under apartheid in South Africa. Now, does she know a thing or two about discrimination and how when you limited access to, you know, health and opportunities, you're wasting, you know, a lot of talent in the world? Angela Huang heads up this program. She's, you know, a biopharmacologist. She's also a brilliant manager, but she also has a visceral connect, you know, to what she's doing at Pfizer, and she has led that amazingly well. And came out of a leadership program at Pfizer called Breakthrough, which, you know, in the business of lifting up people who previously were excluded from leadership.
You know, it's interesting in this hybrid environment. During the pandemic, the number of women in senior roles actually fell back. What advice do you have? Because there are a lot of people whose careers are now being spent largely in their bedrooms or their dining rooms, where I would imagine it's harder to convey the kind of executive presence that gets you into the C-suite.
Right. The data is fascinating in terms of what happened to high potential women, you know, in over the last 4 years. It is true that they disproportionately left. I took a break, mostly because of the educational challenges that their kids were going through. And as they go back to work, disproportionately, they are choosing remote work situations because it's how to make the rest of their lives work. And my data shows that hybrid is much better than fully remote.
Mm-hmm.
because, Catherine Mann at the Bank of England keeps on telling us, that social connection has to happen to earn the trust of other leaders, to get sponsorship, to actually, win new clients. And she said she's afraid that it's a kind of new mommy track, the virtual track and the
Yep.
in-person track. And it's a problem if that turns out to be a real pattern. There is another thing happening, which I talked through in my book. Some leaders are doing some very inventive stuff in the hybrid space.
Mm-hmm.
Tiger Tederigan at Genpact, for instance, is doing in-office retreats every 6 months or so, each team centered on innovation, bringing all of the team, collaborators, to an office that's nearest them. They break bread, they have dinner, they get to know one another, and it's happening about once every 6 weeks. And that, he is finding, is leveling the playing field again, because even women who are perhaps working a little more remotely than men are plunging into those mini retreats with great appetite and enthusiasm, and again feel fully part of teams. So it's a question, I think, of breaking down the remoteness of remote work, and that is beginning to happen, in the middle of 23.
I'm curious. You and I both watched, the trends around how we talk about these issues ebb and flow. And one of the other differences, of course, is we've had Me Too, which I know you have written about as well, in the last 10 years. How are you finding, are there generational differences in how we think about executive presence, and even the desire that you're seeing? I mean, I'm curious about this new generation that's coming into the workforce and how they're thinking about work, because they've been forged from a very different experience than you and I.
On the communication front, for instance, but also in how you show up in terms of your personal appearance online as well as in person. What I'm finding is that younger leaders, individuals in their 30s, are working
Mm-hmm.
in, small companies as well as large, working in small companies as well as large ones. They value authenticity enormously. And they both see a need to project an ability to inspire, to convince, to be compelled to become a leader, to be seen as one, doing it a different way. And for instance, in terms of top characteristics in the appearance bucket, being well-groomed and physically attractive, those things are a thing of the past. Not that they're not on the list at all, but they're certainly
Being
not a
well groomed is a thing of the past.
well, people like the idea of being polished. But to this younger generation, well-groomed implies, a helmet of lacquered hair or a
Right.
stiff gray suit or something. And they seek flair, they seek distinctiveness, but it has to reflect who they are. And, some of their role models are people like Eddie Glaude,
Mm-hmm.
uh, people like Michelle Obama. It's not that we don't know these people, but it's not Jamie Dimon or Mitt Romney anymore. And
Right.
some of the top choices are female and people of color. Amanda Gorman is seen as a total role model in terms of how to turn up in public and transmit her vibrant, brilliant ideas. Uh, but I was fascinated that 1/4 of the many executives I interviewed last year pulled out 2 people in terms of who they felt were their personal role model. One was Eddie Glaude, because
Mm-hmm.
he not only aces the polished thing and has virtual communication down, mixing storytelling and erudition in 2 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
incredibly crisply and clearly. He's a total model. But he puts himself in the picture. Uh, July 4th last year, he spoke on NBC. He was given 3 minutes. And he talked about what a difficult holiday it was for people of color because of the legacy of slavery. And
Yep.
he gave a few poignant examples. But then he said quite quickly, he said, this is my history. All of its ugliness, all of its beauty, all of what it is and could become. My grandmommy is buried in Moss Point, Mississippi. So I am deep an American.
Mm-hmm.
So it was such a kind of inspirational, but kind of a brutal reminder. It was truthful. It had enormous courage. And, that went viral. It was an amazing address. And the other person that was unexpectedly seen as a model by my 73 executives was Gustavo Dudamel.
Okay, that's not a name everybody knows.
No, but he's international, you see. And
Yep.
a lot of my interviewees, worked in, different growth hubs around the world. It was because he's so brilliant at empathy and body language. And comes off as the ultimate, kind of lifter up of other people's value. He's not a maestro in the old sense of the word. But these examples were being given to me by, 37-year-olds, not by 55-year-olds. So I think there is this search to emulate the authenticity and distinctiveness of a person who is enormously good at what they do, but willing to have this, I guess, empathetic collaboration going on, which is much more admired now than it was 10 years ago.
So what
and
advice?
If you can do it on, yeah.
Well, I'm curious to get the advice you have for people. Again, there's such a broad swath of the audience out there, and you have, C-suite clients. You also talk to, I'm sure, many young people as well. But in general, especially if you were to hone in on circa 2023, what we need to do to really not just project leadership, but get ourselves into these senior roles where, frankly, women are still underrepresented.
Right. My most powerful thought is that understanding the power of inclusion, not just in terms of bringing all of yourself to the table,
yep.
and figuring out how to talk about your ancestry in ways that make you an inspirational figure. Eddie Glaude certainly does it.
Mm-hmm.
But understanding, and this was fascinating, that study that BCG did in 2019, which was about the impact of diversity on innovation and growth, mm-hmm. which demonstrates that if you have at least three types of diversity around leadership tables, you're 19% more likely to be a fast innovator, an effective mm-hmm. one. 50% of the leaders I interviewed were aware of that article and had taken it to heart, which was amazing.
Wow.
Yes. And I think that is an enormously powerful thing to arm yourself with as a corporate leader these days, because think of what just happened to the Supreme Court, right? In terms of...
When you talk about the Supreme Court, you're obviously referring to what's happened with affirmative action and the conversations that's causing in the workplace.
Right. And I'm thinking at the moment that the private sector is kind of on the right side of history in some ways, in terms of increasingly valuing the different voices, ever since Suriwaki, the wisdom of crowds. Ever since the wisdom of crowd was published, we've known, that groupthink is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. And to mm-hmm. have different experiences, different toolkits, different skill sets, in the C-suite is an incredibly good idea for growth and competitive strength. But I think that message has sunk in very deeply. So in my data, you can see across 35 sectors that inclusivity is now one of the top qualities sought after in a leader. Now, you can't be an inclusive leader without having a company that gives priority to DEI, which is what DeSantis or some of the conservative leaders in the UK are beginning to rail against. So I feel that one of the most powerful things you can do as an up and coming, high performing talent is to immerse yourself in some of that data or some of that value and become, adept at tapping into the extraordinary range and richness of talent on your team, in your company. And if you do that effectively, you yourself will become a much more appreciated and successful leader.
Sylvia, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge that you have a global business. You speak to leaders worldwide. And we've just talked about some of the things happening in the U.S. that are going the other way, whether it's the extremist politics, what's happening with the Supreme Court. Where does the U.S., rank on these issues, or how do you think we're doing on these issues with regard to women's leadership, executive presence, relative to other countries?
In terms of women in leadership, the U.S. is still, right at the top of the list.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, the progress stalled a little during the pandemic, but I'm hopeful it'll get back on track. Obviously, in terms of women on the front lines in blue-collar jobs, that's a whole different story and not a good story.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found was the great good news of this book is that whether it be integrity, respect for others, inclusivity, or authenticity, all of these qualities are now right at the top of the list in terms of what very seriously they're looking for in their bench strength when they are figuring out, who to put their weight behind, who to send to the leadership training programs. And that is incredibly good news. It means it's sunk in, right? And the value of that, the BCG study being a case in point, is now widely believed in and acted upon. I think the political reality in this country, but also elsewhere, is kind of going in the other direction. There was a big piece this weekend. Farag is now railing against woke capitalism in London because he feels that liberal values have infected the private sector. And obviously we see that happening in Florida. And the other core attributes of leadership, whether it be integrity, courage, right? Which corporate America still believes in, truth-telling. They have slipped in terms of at least some, key leaders in the political world. And I think that the Supreme Court decision in terms of, denying the validity of affirmative action, the question is whether that is going to, push corporate America away from its commitment to DEI. And I think it won't, because the reasons that all of the executives were giving for why they were so proud of the programs that had advanced women, had advanced people of color, had advanced global talent, was because the enormous value of this to innovation and their ability to expand market share and add new marketplaces. And they gave me all of these examples, which I talk about in the book. So it's in enlightened self-interest, perhaps. It's, not because they are on some barricade, but enlightened self-interest is a currency of the private sector that's being used enormously effectively over the ages. So I think right now, these commitments, which are deepening and not waning, I see them as good news.
Yeah, I think you're right. Talent is a real issue. I don't know if there's anything else, Sylvia, that's on your radar that you would want to put on ours, because I think that, this is a body of work that you've developed over the course of, now a decade, but there are many other areas you're also looking at. I'm curious, in terms of the global landscape and where your priorities are right now, what else you'd want to mention?
The arm-to-arm combat of inclusion is something I call sponsorship.
Mm-hmm.
And it's incredibly important today. This obviously, I think most people understand what it is these days. It's a senior executive, taking a bet on you, understanding your value, understanding your value add to the company, and doing some vigorous advocacy. Sponsorship is something you have to earn, because obviously what this senior leader is doing is using up political capital on your behalf. And they're not going to do that unless you're really delivering that stuff. So it's deeply meritocratic. And the world over, sponsorship is a mini me thing, because senior leaders, whether they're white or pink or, whatever their
You remind me of me at 23, that kind of thing, right? Or 33.
This is how you started this conversation. But what I have seen, and actually American Express is a very good example of this, is that the top 300 people are, it's a leadership competency at American Express. That you need to have a portfolio of 3 sponsees over 5 years, and 2 of them cannot look like you. In other words, you need to go and take a very serious look at a lot of folks out there who are totally the right material, but generally don't have someone that looks like them at the top. And it's had a demonstrable effect on women at the top, but also other forms of
no, I think that's excellent point. What you measure matters, and the metrics really define sort of where you're going to go. So I can't think of a better place to end than there. And good luck with the book, Sylvia, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
And thank you. It was really challenging and interesting. So I'm very happy.
Really good stuff. And the book, again, is Executive Presence 2.0, and we're talking with Sylvia Ann Hewlett. Thanks very much.